You're watching the Microsoft US Health and Life Sciences Confessions of Health Geeks podcast, a show that offers industry insight from the health geeks and data freaks of the US Health and Life Sciences industry team. I'm your host, Claire Bonacy. For this podcast, I'm switching roles. I'll be interviewed by our producer, Tracy Picone, on the importance of diversity and inclusion in pharma and life sciences, and specifically the importance of diversity in clinical trials.
Hi, Claire. Welcome to the Confessions of Health Geeks podcast, as you know. But today you're in the hot seat and I'm going to be the host.
Well, thank you, Tracy. I know it's very weird being on this side, but I'm excited. I'm excited to talk a little bit about pharma and clinical trials.
I have a couple of questions for you, but I also want to prepare you for a rapid fire question session, just a little bit. So, April is Diversity Month, and we've been seeing the pharma conference DIA has been having a real focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. You have worked in clinical trials and are an expert in this space, in the pharma space. So in your words, how is diverse representation, or why is diverse representation so important? And I guess, and also, what have you learned throughout COVID?
Yeah, well, definitely, I think this is something that is really, really important, especially just because of the lack of diversity in pharma and in clinical trials and just the history of that. I think, as a whole, the industry has come a long way, but there's still a lot of way that they need to go. I think when it comes to even women in clinical trials, after the thalidomide situation in the 60s, the FDA basically excluded all women of childbearing age from early trials in the 70s. And obviously we know that, men, they do respond differently to medicines, very similar to how people of different ethnicities respond different to medicines. So obviously women will respond very differently as well. So this posed a huge problem. In the early 90s, actually, the FDA, they removed that ban from women in clinical trials. But a recent report, I think it was a few years ago, the FDA released it, that women only represented around 43% of clinical trial participants globally. So clearly it's still, the ramifications from that decision are still kind of felt today. And obviously that results in women, and obviously we have to assume minority populations as well. They're at a greater risk of having adverse events due to maybe just a lack of representation in those trials for the medications that they're taking. So obviously, I don't think it's a sex issue in particular. I think it's more of a overall diversity problem within the industry, but also kind of within those trials in the industry. If trials are not conducted with people from all demographic and non-demographic characteristics, that includes, sex, race, ethnicity, age, even patients with like organ dysfunction or different comorbidities, then the industry as a whole, it's not serving the entire population equally. Obviously, that's the ultimate goal of every pharma company. And even from a business perspective, they're missing a large population of just people that could be buying or using their products if they're not making the medicine for everyone. And obviously, when it comes to COVID, everything had to stop. Trials had to stop. And they really had to look at, hey, can we serve rural populations? Can we serve patients that might not be able to come into the hospital every day? Obviously, I think people are very privileged that can, drive 20 minutes to a hospital, but that's not the case globally. That's definitely not the case in the US everywhere. I think the pandemic kind of showed much more inequities, especially in clinical trials. And I think that's something that definitely the industry is kind of woken up to.
Do you think that will continue?
I do. I think the last 12 months of the pandemic really expedited healthcare as a whole, probably more than in the last 5 or 10 years. That definitely happened in clinical trials. That definitely happened in pharma. I think there's this huge emphasis now on decentralized clinical trials and trying to make that available to everyone. So I do think it's probably going to continue. I mean, I hope it does.
Right. For sure. I think, how do you serve the entire population if you don't represent the entire population? How do you make choices for people if they're not a part of, the entire program to start, right? How do we do that? We don't want to do that. We shouldn't be doing that. Okay. So given you do have this expertise in clinical trials, right? This is where you spent the first part of your career. Why did you make the leap to a technology company? We all have our reasons for getting over into technology, whether it's scale or making a bigger impact. But why did you make the leap to a technology company?
Yeah, well, definitely, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there around scale. But really, I loved working in clinical trials. I loved working at a top pharma company. And I think realistically, if I was still there, I'd probably still love it. But the reason I decided to make that change to a tech company was really because I saw so many gaps in technology in the pharma and life science industry as a whole. It was not just a problem within trials or the trial data or my company or my group. It really was a whole issue with the industry. I mean, I think, across every pharma company, there's so many disparate and legacy systems and the manual tracking of data that happens every day. And when I say data, I do mean like tons and tons of data just everywhere. Everything is data and everything is generally done pretty manually. I think that was a huge gap and an opportunity for technology to kind of play a bigger role. And so obviously I felt that maybe my direct experience in trials and pharma could somehow be leveraged to actually create solutions for the industry as a whole in like a more scalable way that could be implemented across the whole industry. So I really thought, maybe I could make more of a difference than trying to do something just in my department or just in my company. So that's kind of why I started looking outside of my company and trying to figure out like, how could I go to a tech company? How could I make a difference kind of on the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I love that, because that's one of the reasons I came from med tech. And that was one of the reasons too, right? Just seeing these gaps where I thought technology was the impetus to changing and supporting all constituents, right? So the patient, the clinicians, the systems, the C-suites of all of these health systems, the payer space. So we have talked about, we're talking about equity. It's a hot topic right now, and it has been for a long time, but I think we've seen lots of disparity in care over the last 12 months. It's really been highlighted. We've known it's been there, but it's been highlighted. How do clinical trials become more equitable? And then what's the role of technology? Like, how do we bridge that gap with those two, with the technology?
I'll say what everyone has probably heard, that diversity and inclusion, they need to be a focus in every industry, especially in pharma and life sciences. But what I really mean by that is that diversity and inclusion should be part of every pharma and life science company's company blueprint and plan as a whole. If it's not part of how the company operates daily within that company, it's probably going to not carry over to how trials are run. So especially if I know a lot of companies, they have, yearly audits or internal audits or checks to ensure that they're kind of living up to their values. So I think if they're really making sure that diversity and inclusion is one of those values and they're keeping up on it, then it's going to carry over into trials. I think it's important to kind of have that diverse workforce as well at every management level. I think especially in middle management, since that's where a lot of the like on the ground decisions are made for clinical operations, which typically run clinical trials. I think that would mean, having more women and having more people from diverse backgrounds, whether that's race or age or sex or neurocognitive diversity. I think having all people to be in those decision-making positions or even consulted about the decisions that they are making could really expand the amount of equitable clinical trials that are out there. And I think it also, when it comes to increasing diversity just in trials, if you think about specifics, even just expanding eligibility criteria for trials, sometimes just the strictness of the eligibility has some kind of unconscious bias built into it automatically, or even expanding the location of trials like we talked about with decentralized trials to make sure that people from rural or diverse locations can still be part of it and you can still get that data. And then, of course, I think something that I always liked doing was kind of working with the patient advocacy groups or community-based clinics, since you do get a very diverse population there as well. So although that's not necessarily focused on technology, I think technology plays a part in all of those, since obviously we see the work of ethical AI coming into play, focusing on making sure that there's less bias, and then of course just the decentralized clinical trial methods of having remote patient monitoring or having ways that all of this could be done almost from an iPhone or from an app to make it a little bit easier. So hopefully technology plays a role in all of it. I think it's slow going currently.
Yeah, I remember sitting in a room listening to a speaker, and they were talking about the millions and millions and millions of pieces of paper. And it just struck me, if you have to go through all of that manual process, the last thing that's going to be maybe on your mind is the diversity part, because there's so much that you have to go through and support, whether it's through the FDA, positioning and everything else. It's like, so without the technology, how do you do that, right? So maybe the technology will bring that visibility that we're all talking about, right? And be able to scrub the data so that like in real time, what's happening.
Exactly. Hopefully, we can, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, yes. And I like that you talked about ease, right? Ease, and then the general working with the communities. Like, does that happen often, or was that just one of your passions?
It happens sometimes, but I think it's harder, especially when trials are run globally. So for those larger trials, it's really hard to be able to know, okay, how do you do this in the Ukraine, or how do you do this in other countries? So you really have to rely on other vendors or CROs, and really making sure that you kind of have to go out of your way to be like, hey, we need to assess and make sure that we're getting community hospitals involved, or community clinics, or advocacy groups. It's not something that, it's like built in. It really does have to be kind of like a check that you really make at the beginning before you start a trial, unfortunately.
I have so many questions for you. We're going to do another podcast, maybe several more, because I have questions. I think we need to tackle things like fear.
Yes.
And how do we support our communities, right, if there's a level of fear. So we have more to come for sure. But I want to get to the rapid fire questions, okay? So answer the first thing that pops in your head. I know it's kind of mean, but let's do this. Okay. Name in your vision, name the root causes and barriers to inclusion in clinical trials.
Well, I feel like the first one would probably be racism, an obvious one. I think another one is probably like language barriers, since we saw that in just like global trials, and then probably just like socioeconomic constraints, or like just the overall kind of language barriers or communication barriers with different populations.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is good. Okay, favorite thing about working in clinical trials?
Ooh, I think probably designing the protocols, specifically in different regions. I feel like it was really cool to kind of understand the different cultures of that region. I think it was really cool designing the ones in Japan, because they just had such a different way of doing things, and making sure that you always had to do things out of respect. Like it was so cool to learn about. So it really, although I was designing protocols, it was more, oh, I'm learning about this Japanese culture, which I thought was super fun.
That sounds awesome. Okay, favorite part of designing those protocols besides the cultural aspect?
Yeah. I'd probably say working with like the medical affairs teams and the doctors, because they were the experts. They were the most knowledgeable and passionate about those disease states, that it was just so kind of cool to see them so excited, and talking about these disease states that they were just so passionate about solving. So I think that was kind of fun of, being able to talk to these really high up doctors that knew so much more than I did, obviously.
Oh, I love it. All right. Thank you so much, Claire. This has been great. I love that you're in the hot seat now, because usually Claire is our host of Confessions of Health Geeks. And as I said, we are going to discuss, we've got so much more to discuss. So definitely tune in for the next episodes of, I don't know, should it be Confessions of Health Geek Pharma Edition?
I love it. Exactly. It should be.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you all for watching. Please feel free to leave us questions or comments below, and check back soon for more content from the HLS industry team.